Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tae, he hia ki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora. Ko titirangi te maunga, ko waio te awa, ko ngai tamaterangi Ngāti Hine Waiatarua me Ngāti Whaitanga Hapu, ko Ngāti Kahungunu Ngā Rauru me Ngāti Raukawa Ngā Iwi, ko rangi āhua te marae, ko meri wai paupau te tipuna. He kaipūtahi rangahau ahau, ko Kim Hamilton taku ingoa. Welcome and thanks to all for joining us this morning. Ngā mihi to all the community groups and NGOs from throughout Aotearoa and also to those from government agencies who are looking for insight to inform your work. I appreciate those joining us from other countries around the world, and we realise that this is a time of many challenges to community organisations and whānau. What Dr Juan Tauri and Dr Antje Deckert have to present today is very relevant to how we can work to ensure that community research supports Indigenous research knowledge, practice and communities. Throughout the webinar, we invite you to log into the Community Research Facebook page to post any questions, or of course, log them into your chat and Q&A. If you want to be notified when we're broadcasting our next webinar, please join our Facebook page and the Community Research Discussion Group. You can also subscribe to our monthly e-news by emailing communications@communityresearch.org.nz. So in our webinar today, we've got a chance to learn more about what we can do as community organisations, government agencies, and I guess academics in our research and evaluation practice to support cultural and Indigenous ethical practice in our work. Dr Antje Deckert is a senior lecturer at Auckland University of Technology, Faculty of Culture and Society, School of Social Sciences and Public Policy. She's a specialist in criminology and criminal justice and cites herself as a scholar activist. Antje is dedicating her career to anti-racism and to centering Indigenous voices. Her research and teaching serve to consider the contributions criminology as an academic discipline has made and continues to make to the oppression of Indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities. To quote Dr Deckert, "Recognising this reality, I have come to identify myself as an anti-criminologist. As such, I am in collaboration with like-minded academics across the globe on a journey to find better ways to address social harm within academia and society." And Dr Tauri, you'll recognise, hopefully, he presented a community research webinar earlier this year on Indigenous perspectives of criminology and justice. And Dr Tauri has a PhD from the University of Wollongong and a master's from Cambridge. He's currently a senior lecturer at the University of Waikato, and the papers taught by Dr Tauri emphasise Indigenous ways of understanding and knowing, as well as Indigenous experiences of crime control in settler colonial contexts. They've both contributed to a recent publication on Indigenous research ethics, and I'd like to invite them to speak about, there we go, there's a picture of it there. Yes, it's very much in the, two for one. So over to you, Juan, if you'd like to kick us off today. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Kim. Kia ora, everyone. It's really, this is the issue, the area of Indigenous research ethics, and more to the point, and from the research that I've done, which is a critical, if you like, analysis of the way in which government departments in settler colonial context, most especially New Zealand, and the academy, the different research institutions, undertake or seek to undertake to do ethical research with Indigenous people is an issue that is very close to my heart. It's something that, as I said, I've actually done research on myself, which is on Indigenous people's perspectives of research ethics boards and their conduct, and also government departments, particularly in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. So I'm especially pleased to be having this conversation with you today, because something I think that needs to be said is that putting aside for a moment that Linda Smith, our esteemed Māori or Indigenous scholar, publication in 1999 of Decolonising Research Methodologies, the type of conversation we're having today, 10, 15 years ago would have been very rare, or even actually difficult to be able to come together and have a critical discussion on this particular issue. So I'm really, really pleased to be to be speaking with you today. Okay. Sorry, I'll just have a quick look at my notes. Yes, the book. So we're not going to talk specifically about the book, this one here. And I have kudos has to go to Dr. Lily George, who was the instigator and the driver and power behind this particular volume. And it's a really important volume because it does something that I'm not going to do in my talk, but I will probably try to do in question time. What the book focuses on, in part, is some of the problems, or the problematic, if you like, of governmental and academic research ethics in relation to engaging with Indigenous people. And I want to talk about what some of those issues are and why it is important for us to discuss them openly. The book touches on that in part, but in the most part, it is Indigenous scholars across different settler colonial contexts and our non-Indigenous critical allies like Antje and others, and Chris Caneen and others, okay, about our response to those issues, okay, about the development of our own research ethics protocols and processes that are, if you like, imbued with our own tikanga, if you like, our own values and our own beliefs around how it is that we go ethically carry out the process of gathering and disseminating and sharing knowledge. Okay. I'm going to talk about the problems, so to speak, and how we have reacted to them in part, and then I'm going to hand it over to Antje to talk about her own experiences as a non-Indigenous critical ally scholar in this particular space. Yeah. Claiming research. Okay, cool. Okay, so I'll start with a story, very, very quick story about why this is so central to, so important to me. And that's when I started my PhD many, many years ago. And I will name the institution at AUT, where Antje is. And my research was on, this is important case study because it, I think, demonstrates a whole range of the issues that are facing us when we deal with government agencies who unfortunately exhibit many of the same problem behaviors I'm going to talk about, and especially the Western Academy. And my research was started out as a comparison, or if you like, between Indigenous First Nation communities in British Columbia in Canada and Māori around crime control policy and the development of crime control policy. And so for the Canadian context, I had engaged over a period of time since the early 2000s with two particular Indigenous or First Nation communities in British Columbia, and decided when I did my research that I would go back and re-engage with them and speak to them about the research that I would like to do with them, et cetera, which is good practice and it is good Indigenous practice. And so I went through that process and I dealt with elders councils and asked them, how am I to do this work ethically? And so they told me, it wasn't a suggestion, it was, you need to do this. So I ran and wrote up my ethics application, sent it into the Research Ethics Committee at AUT University. And I knew that it was going to cause problems because one of the First Nations in particular that I dealt with, the Elders Council said, do not turn up with a written consent, individualized consent form. Our process is that you will be asked to come and you will be asked to speak at a community gathering. The Elders Council will be there. And if we deem you to be a trusted person, we will give you permission. And it's likely to be someone designated by the Elders Council, and it will be verbal. And that is our ethical consent for you to carry out this research. And this was rejected by the committee outright, to the point where they basically, and we went back and forwards, and of course I argued the point, that basically it got to the stage where they actually deemed me potentially an unethical researcher with both Māori, my own people, and with the First Nation communities in British Columbia. And my response to that was, you're basically saying that the ethics protocols that are required by the First Nations in Canada are unethical. And so that's when I decided, when I did I finally got my agreement to go ahead after much debate. So I decided to add on to my research to talk to these First Nation communities and other Indigenous scholars about their response to the behaviour of the Research Ethics Board in New Zealand. And I've published about 3 or 4 articles from that if you want to look them up. And they, of course, were heavily critical. They were aghast that their protocols were considered to be unethical. And that I, as someone that they had advised about how to do that properly, would be deemed as such. Okay. So in my research, I found that with both, and these issues actually I find exist within many government agencies. Even today, even though we today have significant focus within research ethics protocols, for example, on Mātauranga Māori. Okay, there's usually a section within your ethics application where you have to deal with particular questions about how you're going to ensure the safety of your research, your ethics of your research related to Māori, et cetera, et cetera. You know, we have Te Arateka, which is a guideline for Māori research ethics. We have our own independent, okay, body that you can actually go to have your research ethics framework for Māori research tested and agreed to. But despite that, there are still, I think, some of the issues that my researchers raised that are still pertinent. There's 4 or 5 that I've written down out of many, but these are the 5 to me, or 4 or 5 issues that I keep. Okay, what happens with a lot of the processes, and this includes with the Mātauranga Māori section of the ethics protocols that I'll discuss at the very end before we segue into Antje's talk. And one of them is standardization. What happens with a lot of these protocols at both the government and within the institutions is that the process itself is a tick the box one. Okay, it's very formulaic. So you're given a lot of direction about how you should proceed and how you should answer. And that of itself, which I call standardization, there is a fundamental reason for that most members of research ethics boards and government agencies will not tell you is the reason, is it because it makes the decision-making process easier. It's easier to compare, you know, one Māori research protocol to another. Why is this a problem? Because it stymies the flexibility that is required to do research in any community, but most especially with Indigenous communities. It assumes that there is a sameness, if you like, or a shared understanding of how it is to be ethical from one Indigenous community to another. Try telling that to Ngāti Porou and Ngāti Kanganunu, right? You can imagine what would happen in that regard, yes? Secondly, they are very much focused on, within these kind of Western contexts, on sanctifying the individual participant. So the individual becomes paramount. This is the reason why the preferred way of demonstrating that you have consent from your participants is the individualized consent form, which needs to be signed. Or if not a form, then at least you need to be seen to be glorifying the individual, right? And this was one of the key issues that AET Research Ethics Board had with my application, right? That I did not sanctify the individual, and that the consent protocols were in fact embedded within a communitarian ethos about the sharing of knowledge. Yeah, that's the second one. Related to this, the third one, and these are related, is that I and many of my research participants and other Indigenous scholars I've dealt with find the protocols of these bodies very tokenistic. And the Mātauranga Māori section in many cases is, I find as well, is very, very tokenistic. And it's because it does not allow for difference in what is considered by a community to be ethical protocol. And I think underlying these issues is the fourth issue, which is the lack of expertise on our research ethics boards and even within the governmental departments. Most now have Māori members. I'm sorry to say this, but I've had engagement with a couple of in New Zealand and in Australia. Australia's worse. I mean, some of them don't even have Indigenous people on their ethics boards, but they'll generally have an anthropologist or a Pākehā criminologist who once, I don't know, had looked out the window, saw some Indigenous people and decided that that was what I call window gazing research, and decided that they were somehow experts in our protocol, or they read some Pākehā guy's anthropological text from 20 years ago, and they are the expertise. But there is a real lack of expertise. Again, not to demean Māori members, but in my experience in the past is that what they generally do is they can't find anyone on their staff, so they invite someone in from the community. And they do generally have expertise in the ethics protocols, but they are often, because they are the only member of a board of 15 or even more sometimes, spoken over, undermined, silenced, and what have you. Yeah? And that's been my experience as well, the real lack of expertise. But I should add another one, and this is something I just thought about this morning. And this comes from a recent experience from Antje and I, which I won't talk about. And that is not so much a lack of expertise, but non-Indigenous members of these boards or the committees within government agencies who think they're the experts because they once maybe again did a small project or what have you, or a member of a team, who then believe that they have the expertise to be able to advise experienced researchers like myself. Well, I do consider myself, after 25 years, to be at least partially experienced, and others, about how we should proceed with our research. They're the dangerous group to me in both the government agencies and on the research ethics boards. They're dangerous too, because I do find that they generally have very fragile egos, and when they are challenged over their so-called expertise, it gets very personal. Overall, the approach is often to Indigenous scholars and our research protocols that are developed in tandem with Indigenous communities is very condescending, what I call the condescending ethos. The condescending ethos. And that, you know, lip service is paid to the philosophy that sits under, for example, Te Ara Tika, which I think is, in actual fact, in my view, one of the most, it's a significantly important piece of work. Okay, a guide. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. How am I going for time, Kim? You told to shut me down.
I was going to shut you down in about 3 minutes.
Cool.
Yep, but your train of thought there was around the lip service, yep. The condescending. Yep. Yep.
And so how we responded to that, well, one is that Te Ara Tika is one, the development in New Zealand, of course, of the independent board, of which Dr. Lily George is a member. And I, for those of you contemplating doing research in this field, and after my talk, distrustful of going to government agencies, which is a good thing, or to the Western Academy, that's a good body to go to, because it has people who are experienced and who have experience and researching with Māori in a very ethical way. This is not a new thing. Other First Nations, in fact, have set up their own ethics protocols and demand that, even though, and one of them I'm thinking of, which is the most famous example, is the Mi'kmaq people around Nova Scotia, who developed their own system. They have their own elders-led ethics board. And because they got sick and tired of the demeaning nature of the research that was done by them by non-Indigenous scholars, who turned up and said, but I can do this because my University of Windsor's ethics board, gave me a pass, often without any prior or initial engagement with the First Nation themselves. And so Mi'kmaq said, no, we've had enough of this. So, so if you turn up and you say, I want to do research with you, I've got my ethics clearance. They go, yeah, you don't have ours. And you've got to go through their process. And there are one or two other First Nations, I think the Iroquois do the same. and the Dene, or the Navajo as we tend to refer to them as well. Okay, I think that, and then you have the other response, of course, is research by people like myself that are hopefully exposing some of the core issues. I want to finish, though, by talking about, and I thought long and hard all week about whether I would mention this as an issue, and I will. So I'm going to stick my neck out. One of the other issues that I'm finding slightly problematic personally, and I know this is shared by a number of other Māori scholars as well, those of us who are urbanized, non-reo speaking individuals, and that is the way in which the Mātauranga Māori, or the kaupapa Māori component of these research ethics boards protocols and other protocols has itself become very standardized. What I mean by that is that some committees presuppose that it means that there is a particular way of researching with Māori. And so that is replicating that kind of standardization overall of research ethics protocols. And it is stymieing and those of us who want to do research with Ngā Mōrehu, with certain groups like my age group of Māori, many of us who did not have the opportunities that our children have and our grandchildren to learn reo and to engage with tikanga. And so when you present doing research, as I did not that long ago with urban youth gang members, Māori gang members, and was questioned about why I wasn't following certain types of protocol, which are seen as, if you like, the tikanga of how you engage and do research with Māori. And I spent a long time having to explain that, having done research with these groups in the past, that approach for many of them will be alienating. And therefore what you are doing is you are corralling our practice within a very formulaic or standardized understanding of what it is to live as Māori and to express your identity as Māori, if I'm making that clear. And some of our own who work within the kaupapa Māori framework are, I think, also responsible for this kind of conduct. And I think that there needs to be a serious and significant discussion about how we, don't get me wrong, I agree with virtually all of the principles that and values that are embedded within the kaupapa Māori research framework. But it also must be able to take into consideration a vast difference in the lived experience of mātauranga, Māori or tikanga that many of us have. And I'll end there.
Yeah, thanks, Juan. I think Linda Smith covers that off in terms of the ethics approach around not flaunting your knowledge, but really coming to where people are at, you're coming from where people are at. So thank you for your kōrero and a few challenges laid down there. Thank you, Antje. Would you like to share your whakaaro today?
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Shni Kopu Te Maunga, ko Ora Te Awa, ko Aotearoa Te Wakarererangi, ko Ngāti Tiamane Te Iwi, ko Ngāti Hipihi Te Hapu, ko Pamugornfelder Te Marae, ko Klaus-Jürgen Arno Deckert Tuku Papa, ko Siglinde Gerda Brigitte Sasse Tuku Whaia, ko Aotehuatahi, ko Antje Takoingoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks very much, Kim, for inviting me to this webinar, and thanks for Juan sharing the platform with me. And also a big thanks to Lily George, who allowed us to be part of the book. And my gratitude goes to PhD student or PhD candidate Ria Luthwaite, who is the co-author for me on this book chapter. On the struggle against neocolonial academic exoticizing in postgraduate research. And this is picking up where Juan left off, really, and around a very specific problematic area that is unfolding at the moment. At least in academia, I can't speak to how much that is pertinent to community research, but I imagine that there might be parallels there. So Juan was talking about what is sometimes called, I think, disenfranchised Māori, Māori who don't speak te reo and might not be connected to a particular marae. urban Māori and so forth. And Ria is in a Twanua Quetchen from Dawson City in Canada. And so she got her, so her tribe gave her research mandate to do research on restorative justice practices and comparing the current restorative justice system that was put in place after the sovereignty agreement with the traditional practices, and to unearth what the elders know about the traditional practices and how much what of that is practiced today, and whether that's the old practice are still feasible in the current environment. Now, for some reason, Ria chose out me to guide her through her PhD research. And we had a conversation about what she wanted to do. And she also shared with me some not so nice experiences she had in the past with academics at other universities. And some of them were quite shocking to me to hear. You know, it's like, you're not brown enough to recruit people of your own tribe and things like that. So really shocking statements that she had to deal with. So we had a long conversation. I said, look, I can recommend some other people like Juan or Robert Webb, if you want to have a chat with them as well, or Tracy McIntosh, or all names well known in that area. If you prefer that, you know, it's like, I can connect you guys. But she said, no, I'm sticking with you. I was like, all right. So we went on to formulate her research, and it was very clear the mandate that she had from her tribe, what to research and how to research it. And one issue that is not an issue, but one social reality that is very particular in the Twanua Quetchen tribe is that the deep colonization, and mainly through the native schooling system, generations have been completely robbed of their cultural identity, and even, yeah, what we call mana in being Twanua Quetchen. That is really just resurfacing now, taking pride in who people are, learning the language, the Han language again, and so forth. So deep colonization is a fact there. And that is why the tribe said, you know, do individual interviews, and that's what we call them in the application process, do individual interviews and so forth. And then what she had to experience was, well, if she is Indigenous and she does Indigenous research with Indigenous people, she should be using Indigenous methodologies. And that was thrown back at her from a committee that is completely consistent of European researchers. So there was no consideration of the deep colonization. And so I'm very grateful still to Juan, who wrote a letter of support in the way she conducted her research, because he knows the reality is the same in New Zealand. And we were able to, at the end, get it approved, get the research approved with just standard conversational interviews, but still having to see her go through that process and having to fight one obstacle after the other, so hurdles that I don't see other students necessarily having to take, really inspired this chapter and really made me think about what is going on here recently. So we had in the 1990s this, and especially thanks to Linda Turuai-Smith's book, the awareness of the need for decolonizing research. But I think within the European academic, I think Juan, you called it the woke people.
Yeah.
Yes. The woke academics, it has kind of led to this claim of expertise in that area. And it has also led to an exaggeration of not just the standardization, but also the exoticizing of at least postgraduate students, and potentially also academics might, might experience that, or community researchers to say, it's like, oh, you're Maori, can you do this? Can you do that? And, but with this exoticizing gaze, and this kind of, this is sexy to do in a way. And that is really concerning, especially when you have a background, as you said, as Juan said, of young Maori men in games, maybe never spoken a word of te reo, and really be taken aback by it. So we said if we did some sort of, if my PhD student did some sort of research, so if Ria did some sort of research with a talking circle or whatever was suggested to her, people would be alienated by it, and further harm would be inflicted, because people are made to feel ashamed for not knowing their tikanga, for not knowing their reo. And that is further causing harm from the side of the researcher. And this is the first thing we are all to avoid, right? If we do ethical research, the first principle is to do no harm. So this is just something I wanted to, an experience I want to share with you of what we sometimes might not think about, right? That, that actually using tikanga and that actually using te reo might actually cause further harm to people, and to really consider who are the research participants and where might research participation even vary, So a good way maybe of approaching this and addressing this issue is to have this conversation with each individual participant beforehand, and to have to say, it's like, what would you like to do? Would you like to start with a karakia, or and make it a very individual experience? So in the area that I'm usually doing research in criminal justice, we find that the experience with the criminal justice system and the prison system has often robbed that as well from people, or can be quite tokenistic, because they get like a weekly course inside the prison, a week-long course in the prison, and learn a couple of waiata, and that's it. But still, there is no deep connection to any sort of like doing karakia before a conversation or anything like that. So, and yeah, so I usually go in with sayings like, what do you want? What is it that you need before, after, during our engagement, our conversation, that helps you feel more comfortable? And that's what it is really about for me. It's like, how do people feel comfortable when they talk to me about their experiences? And it's another way of saying to do no harm. If someone feels comfortable, they don't feel harmed by us meeting. So, and I would like them to feel like that. And yeah, before I ramble on any further, that is my 2 cents that I can contribute, I guess, to this conversation.
Can I just sort of, yeah, bounce off something that a point that Antje made, another example, the talking circles. My understanding is that then the ethics board, when they were looking at the application, made a suggestion that, well, hey, how about you use this Indigenous process for your research? Is that correct? Talking circles? Yeah. We refer to that, the usual academic language, sorry, can I say that? Too bad. As Orientalization or Orientalism, and this happens, and this has been in my experience as well of research ethics boards and also in government departments. What that refers to is this sort of looking at Indigenous peoples across all these different contexts as though somehow we are the same. So therefore, a protocol or process that is used by certain Canadian First Nations because they're Indigenous will therefore be applicable to all Indigenous peoples. And this is what happened in that particular context. My experience was when I had my issues with AUT's ethics, I got to keep saying that because Antje works there, was that one of the suggestions that was made when I fought back, one suggestion actually was, well, you know, the individual consent form process has been, this has been utilized and agreed to by other First Nation peoples who have done this research, and their advisors agreed to it. And my response was, that's good for them because that's their choice. That is not, and so in other words, because some Indigenous communities are okay with it, and I have no problem with that because that's what they want. They then tried to retrofit everyone else into that practice. But why? Because it suited their glorification of the individual, right? And so anyway, so I made the point coming back to them is that yes, but the point here is it's because they agreed to it, and that's what they said was okay. They said it was okay. By the way, just so everyone knows, I put it out front, I had to make some concessions about how I would proceed in relation to their consent. And when I did my research in Canada, I totally ignored what the ethics board wanted, because there was a choice between me being unethical to them or unethical to the First Nations that I was engaging with. And that was an easy choice. And that is one, in actual fact, there's actually been some publications about that. A number of Indigenous scholars around the world have talked about that particular issue that they are faced with, about making the choice between being ethical for their own people, and most of them are researching their own, or an ethical researcher as that is considered by a bunch of mainly Pākehā, unexperienced in the Indigenous context, academics.
I think there's a couple of things that are being highlighted, both from your kōrero today, but also when we had Martin speak about the New Zealand Ethics Committee, which is an independent community-based committee. And I think some of it is around the ethics process around university research is in many ways a tick box approach. It's a front-ended, we will sign off your proposal to allow you to go and do the research. And then in essence, there's also the ethical practice of undertaking that research, which is actually about how you go about it and who you go about it with. And I think, you know, issues that come from both of your kōrero really signal to me principles of power sharing and accountability. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts around kind of, you know, you've kind of both talked about examples of how those formal processes haven't worked and how it actually hasn't fitted with the community. But, you know, is there a way of kind of mediating those two tensions particularly for young scholars who may not necessarily have the wisdom and the fight that you two have?
Do you want to answer that first, Antje?
Do you have something in mind?
Just to say it, you know, you raise a really important point, and this is one of the reasons why I've decided to continue to focus on this issue. I don't think I'm making much difference, but hopefully the independent body will, and I will talk about them in a moment. But I can't stress enough how difficult it is, particularly for young scholars who aren't as old and gnarly and no longer give a shit about what people think attitude that I have. But then I'm in a part of my career where I don't really care anymore. But it's so difficult for them, because I can't stress enough the power that these boards have within the academy. And if you do not jump through the hoops that they want, they will make life very, very difficult. We had, Antje and I had a recent student, like 3 or 4 iterations that she had to go through about total. And what it was an ethics board not liking to be told very clearly in an evidence way, when Antje wrote the brief, that you're full of it. That, well, she said it nicer than I am, but it was basically, you don't know what you're doing. And so here's what the literature is, here's what the experience tells us is the appropriate way to proceed. And I remember when I started my PhD at AUT, being invited to a meeting of the postgraduates from the department that I was in, social sciences, what have you, by the postgraduate support, you know. So there's about 12 of us in the room, and I'd just been going through this hell with the ethics committee. And right at the end of and it was a nice meeting, it was a meet and greet. And at the end, one of them said, how's everyone going? How's you all going with your research ethics? And I just sat back while the rest of them just went ballistic and were talking about all these problems. All right, the condescending way that they were spoken down to. If they question any part of dissented to the decision, they were literally being bullied, in my view, and it went round. And I think there's only about one person who said, no, I'm fine, I did okay. And when I walked out, the postgraduate support team just looked at me and said that they were shocked. And I said, well, you shouldn't be, because when you speak to some of your colleagues here, this is a common occurrence. They very much are disempowered and disenfranchised. What do? I get subversive. When I've had students of my own who've had these issues, I tell them, and I hate to say this, play the game. Let's write it in such a way that I haven't always done this, by the way, but I often will say, look, let's tweak it, get you through, and then you do the research as is deemed by the community. So we are forced into being subversive and underhand, and into the committee dishonest, all right? So it is a very disempowering process, especially for young scholars. So therefore, I think that it is beholden to the older, gnarly crowd like me. I won't say that about Antje, she's not there yet in terms of age, but to step up and to speak out. Makes us unpopular, but so what? And I do think that some of that agitation, particularly by Linda Smith and others, Leonie Pihama and what have you in the 90s and 2000s, is why we do now have the independent ethics board that Martin and Dr. Lily George and that, and so this is the evolution that occurs from critical research and commentary and political agitation. I would like to see that. I would like to see, in my view, that committee be where all research that goes on Māori goes to, taken outside of the universities and their inexperienced boards, because those boards, I mean, what is their purpose? My view, their purpose isn't to ensure ethical research. Their purpose is to cover the backsides of the institutions themselves. That's it.
Okay. So in terms of the question you asked about power sharing and accountability, I think that, and I might be wrong there, but I assume that community researchers are much more connected to the community anyway than a lot of the academics in the ivory tower are. And it might be something that I'm suggesting it's very alien sometimes to academics, and it might be very natural to the community researchers, and that is that the research questions are created within the community. That's the first thing. That is power sharing, so I wrote actually a whole article on this idea of power sharing, because I believe that all the power in the research process sits with the research participant. Because if they don't want to participate in my research, I get no data. So all the power is with the research participant in my eyes. And this is how I do treat people who are willing to partake. Yeah? So because I know it's like, well, you don't have to share with me. You can be dishonest with me throughout the entire process. You can lie to my face throughout. I would be none the wiser. And you could make fun of me the entire time through by telling me, fairy tales. And I would write this article that is completely removed from reality, and everyone could laugh at me, So all the power, I think, is really with the research participant. And if the questions come out of the community, then that is also meaningful research. Now, academics often are curious individuals, and they have their own questions about the community, but I think really good research really comes from developing these questions maybe together, right? So an academic as the outsider of the community might have some questions that the community itself might not necessarily ask, you know, because sometimes, as we say, we don't see the forest before the trees, because we're in the middle of the forest, right? So I think there could be a good synergy there between the two forces. And in terms of accountability, I think that is a red thread that also needs to go through the entire process. And that is a constant feedback loop of, and that builds on a good relationship that was built before the research process even started, right? So for me, reciprocity is to give first, to see what the needs of the community are and address some of that and have some shared moments before you even start the research process, right? Instead of going in cold. And in my experience, that also leads to better data, to more in-depth data. So it's more satisfying for the researcher in me as well. So I get more sharing, and people feel more comfortable in the process as well. Because before I start, I often get, after an interview, I get like, oh, if we hadn't been friends, I wouldn't have shared this with you. So people see me as friends because of the relationship building before we even start with an interview, right? So, and that has helped me to stay accountable as well. And if a researcher cares about the people who they're working with, right? So if somebody starts crying, for example, in an interview, I don't have to remind myself that we are now, you know, as the ethics committee says, you have to take a break or make sure that it comes natural, you know, because you care about that individual who you're having the experience with. So I think, yeah, so in terms of power sharing, I think my gratitude is always with the participants who share their power with me, because the power is in their story. And I let them know this right from the get-go, you know, that it's my gratitude to be able to share this space with them. And I can only speak from my own experience, but I find that generates a comfortableness. Is that a word? Comfortableness with me. A comfort in the process, and people tend to relax. And like Juan, I know it's a tightrope walk between that academic expectation that we have to meet with the ethics boards and the actual experience. So I get around these consent forms, for example, by just having a generalized conversation in the beginning of the audio recording to say, hey, you've read the participant information sheet, you know, you understand everything. So I do this verbally. So it is more natural rather than pushing a piece of paper, you know, sign this, which alienates people. That would alienate me as well. If, you know, we're having a conversation and then I get a piece of paper stuck into my face. So I think it's just human. It has nothing to do with Indigenous or non-Indigenous. I think Pākehā just feel just as alienated by signing that kind of consent form as well, you know. So anyway, that was my thought to power sharing and accountability.
Well, the accountability issue, if I could make just a really quick point, hopefully, Kim, you may remember this. I think within the government sector too, that this is one of the principles that not all the time, but is often one that they forget is central to the research process. When they go into different communities to do their research or their evaluation, they basically have a contract with that community and with those individuals. And literally, one of the things that I think that they're very good at subverting is the accountability principle. So part of the accountability principle is to share the knowledge, to share the information that they have developed. And when I was in government, and Kim and I worked together at Te Puni Kōkiri, there's so many times other agencies, and including TPK as well, okay, we fell over on fulfilling that particular obligation because the research was critical of government policy or government interventions, and suddenly would either be rewritten or the report would disappear. and I don't know if Kim remembers, but you were part of a project that we did in the early 2000s on Māori, on domestic violence, and which included interviews with the different Māori women's refuges like Te Whakaruruhau here in Hamilton. Good luck finding that report. I've probably got the only copy because I snuck one home. It's gone. You won't find it, because in that report, there were two sections which the, not our minister, Parikura, but other ministers like MSD, police and whatever, you didn't like. And that was because one of those sections was highly critical of police, the way police policed Māori domestic violence or domestic violence that occurred within Māori communities and Māori families. Okay, and overall government support for the refuges, and one section which talked about the drivers and which included the word colonialism, right? And so the pressure came from these other agencies via their ministers for that report to be eradicated, and it was. And that happened many, many times. Or literally it's just filed and never shared with the participants. And I think, so, you know, I'm heard of all these kind of new approaches within government agencies around co-production of policy, which includes some research, you know, and talk about accountability. But until that they actually harden up a little bit and take their own political needs out of the process, they're going to fail to meet the accountability principle, right? If you have an agreement that includes, in terms of the research context, includes the sharing of information, then you must release it. Yeah. So doing so would be a nice way for the government agencies to start demonstrating that they are able to carry out ethical research with not just Māori, but any community.
I think it's interesting from my perspective, because I do some research and evaluation with government, and I think they are definitely looking for, you know, some of them to reduce the transactional nature of research and to look at notions of partnership. And I do think we're all learning together in that journey. You know, I do know also, one, that there are lots of reports that have been paid for by taxpayers that haven't actually ever seen the light of day, and that is of concern. I think the only way we learn to improve is by hearing the good things and the bad things about what it is that we're doing. So I think there's some real challenges there. I know there were a couple of webinars or comments that we've had from previous presenters. In particular, I'm thinking about Danielle Hromek, who is from Australia. And one of her ways around some of the ethics was to only use Indigenous references in her work, and whether that be art, song, conversations, you know, but that was, and she actually created for her PhD, and again, she talked about a lot of hoops, going through a lot of hoops, you know, a new way of referencing for PhDs in Australia at the time. And I, you know, so I think this is it's a live issue around whose knowledge counts. I know we've got board members who are very keen to make sure that we recognise the expertise amongst our elders and our communities, and that, you know, that is seen as knowledge of great value. And, you know, so there's kind of a lot of things coming up from your kōrero today. We've had a few comments in the chat feed. I'm just wondering, we've probably got about 5 minutes, and it's really hard to pull them through, but Kay shared a presentation by Lil Anderson of Te Arawhiti, looking at how Te Tiriti should be influencing our approach. So, you know, do you guys have a view on how we need to be thinking about Te Tiriti or Waitangi in terms of our research to inform the ethics?
Well, yeah, well, it's the base. It should be the basis of any research relationship between not just iwi, but any Māori entity or community, and whether it be community-based researchers like yourself, academics like myself, or government. And just take any one of the principles. You know, there is that the treaty, one of the core treaty principles as Māori as First Nations in partnership with the Crown, yeah, in partnership. So that's the basis of the power sharing. That's the basis of the of what should how you demonstrate ethical conduct in relation to the accountability principle. So all the things that we've spoken about here, whether it be undertaken by community groups, or whether it be poor research practice by government agencies or the academy in relation to their decisions around research ethics, are breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi. There you go, Kim. We should maybe put forward a urgent application to the Waitangi Tribunal. That would be wonderful. But yeah, I'm joking. I don't have the time to do that at the moment. Okay, so I mean that's the simple answer. Surely Te Aratika and those other types of frameworks, the treaty principles of the treaty in relation to the relationship between the Crown and that, by the way, includes academic institutions that are funded by the Crown, by the way. Okay, therefore have a responsibility to act in all ways that in relationship to the empowerment of Māori, okay, that comes through the treaty itself. That's my own personal view.
Antje?
Yeah, oh, definitely. So that's one aspect of the ethics process that is often tokenistic. You fill out the 3P section and write some nice words, but often I don't see much thought going into it. It's very generalized. So I've actually served on the ethics board at AUT for 3.5 years. So I've seen a lot of these descriptors, and they're very general, tokenistic, and not often thought through very well. So how can the individual research in that particular situation really contribute to people's well-being? And that is often an aspect that is neglected. And it's a challenge for me especially for my, the Pākehā students that I supervise or mentor to really think about it. Yeah, so Juan and I are supervising someone at the moment who is Pākehā, and we really had to challenge and say, it's like, how are you going to do this? How are you going to power share? And in the beginning, there was some, the usual tokenistic description of it. And it's like, no, that's not good enough. Yeah, so we really had to put out a challenge. And I think that is something that we can do in our position, where I say this is scholar activism, to really make people think about that in the scholarly sphere, right? And as I said before, I think it comes more natural probably to community researchers, because the drive is, I see it as a different one than a lot of the ones that academics have, because making communities better and increasing well-being is at the core of what I see in community research. And my kudos to everyone who does that kind of work.
Yep.
Sorry, because I know we're going to go soon, and I'll try and maybe finish on a positive note.
Did you see David's question?
Yes, I did.
Yeah,
can I
so respond to that. Yeah, that would be
perfect. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Is there examples of research that you feel has been done well? Yeah, Antje's. No. But of boards that are taking a better Indigenous or better integrated approach? Yes. And I hate to say it, University of Auckland. I've had engaged with them through research with colleagues like Robert Webb. And what I like about their process, and not a lot of rararu and bullshit comes through in that one, because they have a process there where when it comes within the actual division, or the faculty, they'll have Māori advisors that these protocol, that the ethics applications have to go to for advice and so on, right? So for example, it will go to Robert, a PhD student wants to do research. It'll go to Robert, and Robert will give them advice on it, and then he will sign off on it, and his sign off on it or his views on that will go to the committee. And I think that's a very sensible way, because then, one, it takes the pressure off the usual one member of the committee, Māori committee, of the overall committee, yeah? And they give weight to the Māori academic, or the experienced academic, because we're not always Māori, okay, who has experience and knowledge in relation to how you undertake ethical research. And I think that's a really, really good process. And at the University of Waikato, where I am, you know, as I said, I'm a huge critic of the Research Ethics Board, and they put me on the committee 2.5 years ago when I arrived, which I thought was hilarious. But I've appreciated the way that it's been run, because again, they put weight, the decision around Māori-related research. I feel that I am given, not just me, but there's 2 other members. So there's more than one of us. And this is my own division, not the university. This is Division 1. There are 3 Māori on our committee. Okay, and we have a significant voice. And we have the final say. And I think I appreciate that. So yeah, not all boards, there's been a few, one in particular I've been talking about, and others which I think are hugely problematic. I must say this, I worked in Australia for a long, long time, and it's far worse in Australia than here.
Both of you to give a 1-minute wrap-up summary, because I'm mindful we're kind of heading over time at the moment. And thank you. Yeah. So who would like to go first? Juan? A 1-minute wrap-up?
Wrap up. No, just thank you very much, Kim, again for giving me an opportunity to speak. Thank you to everyone for coming. I hope that was in some way useful. But just to reiterate what I said at the beginning, I am appreciative of the opportunity to talk about these issues, and I think we need to talk about them a lot more. Yes, I know I've done a lot of moaning and groaning about things, but I do think that we need to acknowledge very honestly what the issues are, even within the academy where I work, because only in that way, as I said, are we going to evolve in this space to one where there is true partnership and accountability between all that are, but particularly by us practitioners and by the institutions that we serve.
Yeah, I also would like to thank everyone for listening in and for the great questions that have been asked. If there are any further questions we might be able to answer, I'm happy to do that on the community group Facebook chat after that. So I saw there was one question coming in about the classic tokenistic descriptions. Inya, I'm going to answer that in the chat if you like afterwards. So thanks everyone.
Thank you to Kim and Jenny for organising everything too.
I'd like to mihi to Dr Juan Tauri and Antje Deckert for sharing their wero, their whakaaro and inspiration with us today. We've got a lot of challenges and also opportunities to reimagine and build research processes, communities and a nation that supports future generations. And I think, yeah, there's been lots of great feedback in the chat around the honesty, how refreshing it is to be able to share these issues. So I'd like to mihi to everybody who contributed, who participated today. We've got another Whaikawa webinar hosted by Edmund Whehoko with Dr Janet Tupou in January. It's called Whose Voice Speaks? How Creativity Can Help Pacifica Women and Youth in Aotearoa Find Their Voice. We'd like to take the opportunity to thank you all participants, presenters, for your tautoko throughout this strange year, and hope you found value in the community content and the content community research has provided in our webinars and on our website and through our social media platforms. I'd like to acknowledge the team at Community Research, our former office manager, Janet Miller, whose last day is today, our office administrator and fundraising support manager, Jenny Moore, and the team of contractors who support all our events and work throughout the year, Renee Kiriona, Mariah Pipi Takoko, Dan Mills, David Blair, Kay Marie Dunn, and the many others out there who help support change in community practice and partnership. I'd like to acknowledge our board who have embraced and led a disruptive approach to our work program this year and have ensured that we have increased Māori, Pacifica, Indigenous, multicultural, rainbow community and ethnic perspectives and influence in our work. And I'd like to finally, again, thank you all for joining us today. A video copy of our webinar with Juan and Antje will be available, uploaded and available to share with colleagues later this week. And I would like to wish you all a safe and relaxing holiday season. Mauri ora, kia koutou katoa. Kia ora.
The Community Research website offers a hub for good community research and researchers. It's the place for the public to find and share evidence about effective community practices. The website collects research and evidence and organizes these so that they can be easily accessed and used by other groups. You can access this research and browse by category, by a list of quick-link topics, or by searching for something specific. All of the research is free to download. The community research site is all about excellence and effective practices. You can view recordings of past webinars and find out about future ones. The webinars share evidence about what's working in the community sector. Published by Community Research in 2007, the Code of Practice provides the standards and guidelines for doing research. It's the place to start if you're thinking of undertaking research with or in a community or iwi. As well as the collection of research, we keep a register of experienced researchers who are skilled at working with iwi and communities. To find a researcher who can help you, we have a filter system which allows you to find people based on location, qualification, ethnic group, and area of expertise. The Community Research website is a unique resource for the community sector to use and share. It matters because communities who learn well will do well. It matters because it evidences what's working for us. For researchers and community people alike, we've made it as easy as possible to share your research on our website. Kaua e whakama. Uploading material is quick and simple. Save your work as a PDF and head over to Share Research. Answer a few questions that help us tag and organize the research so it's easy for people to find. If you're a researcher and skilled at working with communities, you can add your details to the directory of researchers so that you can be found. Community research keeps you updated and informed. This helps make you more effective. If you want to stay updated about the latest research, informed about new resources and our upcoming webinars, head over to sign up for our e-news on the home page. Community research is a rich resource built for and by the community. For it to reach maximum potential, we rely on you to contribute, participate, and support the resource to grow and thrive. Mā te kotahitanga e ora ai tātou.